Hi, everyone. Hey. um, firstly, I've been sitting on the seats there facing the stage, but what a view from here. Wow. Um, Thank you so much for the speakers this morning. It's been super inspiring. And what we're going to try and do for the next 40 minutes or so is we would like to start by talking about something that's a little bit harder but necessary for us to be discussing, which is really some of the challenges that players do face, especially as they go through some of the processes around abuse and the challenges that come with that. But I promise you, we are going to become a little bit more optimistic as we go through. And we'd like for everyone today to try and take home something with them that they can actually implement in their own cities, countries, wherever you might be in the world, but something tangible for you to start working on, whether locally, whether internationally, but really to try and shift the dial on this. It isn't really just a narrative that we're trying to bring here. We are trying to action what we're speaking about. So with that, I'm going to put the first question to you both, but as part of that, I think it's also helpful for you to give an introduction, which reminds me I probably should have done my own as well. I'll do that later. But really, what is abuse in the context of players' rights, and why are we here to talk about that today? But before I do, let me just do a quick introduction on who I am, especially for the audience online. So my name is David Alfrey. I am a lawyer with Clifford Chance. I also sit on our global ESG board, and I'm also one of the founding partners of the Center for Sport and Human Rights. So with that, can I start with you, Alexandra?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here representing FIFPRO, the International World Players Association, Football Players Association, and on these topics that are, of course, so relevant to us. Regarding, what is abuse? I think it's about imbalance of power and abusing that imbalance of power. So using in a wrong way the difference of power that people may have in the industry. So this, of course, applies to coaches sometimes that can be in that position. They are like keeping the gates for the future of these players, so they have a lot of power over the players. But it can also be federation people in power, people that take decisions regarding football. And this can actually apply to male players and female players, although we see it more in women's football.
Dev, do you want to say hi? And also I'm going to push you a little bit further on that. So we're still talking about this in 2023, and it would be great to hear from you and from some of your experiences where these are starting to come up a little bit more. And of course, there's some key ones that we will go into in due course. But over to you, Dave.
Now, first of all, thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be sitting here. Thank you to Marios for the kind invitation to have me over in Athens again. And thank you to all of you for attending and for being part of this wonderful summit today. And hopefully it does lead to even more positive change in the future. Finally, thank you to my friend Alexandra for tolerating me, as always. My name is Dev Kumar Parmar. Even though I said that in a very Indian way, I'm an Englishman. I'm based in London, and I've been practicing in sports law for the last 13 years. Prior to that, I was based in criminal defense when I was called to the bar in England, and that kind of led to some of the work that we've had for want of a better word, an opportunity to be instructed in with regards to abuses in sports. I completely latch on to what Alejandra mentioned just now. I completely concur with it, but with regards to where we're seeing it more and more these days, yes, we're seeing it on the women's side. We are seeing it with minors. We are seeing it with men. What I think is more pertinent at the moment is the courage for people to start reporting it. And I'm not necessarily saying that there's been a sea change and all of a sudden, as soon as there is an element of abuse that takes place within football, that people are ready to press the button. But it has become a little bit more available, a little bit more accessible for those that are seeing or suffering abuse to be able to do that. And that has manifested itself in some of the cases that you might want to refer to now from a footballing perspective, although the most prominent ones still are within women's sport, women's football. And unfortunately, the abusers are still primarily male.
And thank you for lining that up perfectly, because I think where we wanted to start with going through some of the cases, and this is really for everyone's benefit. You've got 3 lawyers technically on the panel here, so I appreciate it's not everyone who understands how some of these cases come about, but also what happens next. And so just to add some context, these cases, at least the first ones that I worked on, really started around girls who were within federations, playing locally with challenging socioeconomic situations around them. Some of you may have heard of the cases that followed in Afghanistan. We've had similar reports across the world, including Haiti and several of the African states as well. And the way this works is it's the players themselves who tend to try and raise these complaints. But what we've seen through these cases is that it doesn't always go very far when that does happen. And organizations like FIFPRO, advisors like Dev, are people who stand in, we have done too, to try and support the process. And we're not proposing to go through the process, but what we want to actually highlight is just how much of a tip of the iceberg this really is. And what we mean by that is we also saw what happened recently at the World Cup. Something like the kiss, which I'm sure when I say that, it's very obvious to everyone in the room because it is such a prominent example. But what does that actually mean? And we are seeing increasingly that those who are within this process, who have been subject to these investigations, continue to persist within the sport in many ways. And that sounds like something's not working, especially when you realize that it goes back to the position that these are the gatekeepers to some of these conversations, these are the gatekeepers to the access to some of this. And I want to turn to you, Alexandra, if I may, to really hear from FIFPRO's perspective where we are on this journey. I know it is a journey, and how much more we actually need to do. And you've obviously got first-hand experience for some of these, and in the context of the work that you do.
Yeah, well, there's a very, very long way to go. There is a little bit of evolution, so that's the good news. Like, you have to see whether there are some steps that are taken, but there's so much more to do. There's so much more to do in order to insert proper reporting mechanisms at national level in the different countries. And what is proper reporting mechanism? It's a mechanism that allows a person that is feeling this abuse or that is seeing this abuse on someone else to report it safely to a person or to organization or whatever it can be that will do something about it, that will not report that this person said this, right? And this basic stuff that you say like, yeah, okay, this is common sense, these things are today not being done, right? So at FIFA level, this has improved in the last period, especially after some reforms in the disciplinary committee, in the disciplinary code, sorry. Especially because it's only as of this year, actually, that the victims of abuse are now allowed to, for example, appeal a decision that is taken in FIFA. So you are a victim of abuse, you report it, you go through all the process, you actually help football and society to take this person out of football. They do not belong. They should not be there. You are doing everything. There is a decision, and these players did not have any right to appeal. So the only one that could appeal the decision was FIFA. Yeah. And within FIFA, they have 2 bodies. I don't want to get too technical, but there's an investigatory chamber that, as the word says, carries out the investigation, and then there's an adjudicatory chamber. That is the one looking at this report that they get from the investigatory chamber, and they take a decision. They can also hold a hearing. But when there is a discrepancy between these 2 bodies within FIFA, so when the investigatory chamber says, you know what, I think there's enough evidence to put this person outside of football, it's a dangerous person to football. And the adjudicatory chamber says like, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's enough. The only ones that could appeal this was the investigatory chamber. But it's all FIFA. So I can imagine that it was uncomfortable for a person within FIFA to appeal the decision of FIFA. Yeah. And that in practice did not happen. And that was something really, really terrible for the victims of this, victims or survivors of these abuses. Now this has changed, so this is a huge step forward, but there are many things lacking. There's a lot of lack of expertise. I think there is willingness from the people working in FIFA. I don't think there's enough willingness from the top, to be very honest, because if there was, then you put resources on it, right? So it's not like FIFA is poor and they cannot afford this, right? I mean, I think we all agree on that. So that is very clear to me. That being said, there are people, workers within FIFA that really do their utmost, but they are learning because it's something really new to deal with for them, if you consider, you know, the history of FIFA, because before this was not talked about, this was not dealt with.
Yeah. I just wanted to latch on to what Alexandra was saying with regards to there's this new possibility for the victims of abuse to make that appeal. That's true, but how accessible is it, and do they have information to access that? Now, part of that is down to the great work of what FIFPRO does anyway, to spread this information through all of its constituent unions and all of the people that it works with. But still, for someone that has been abused or been in that kind of situation, they might not have information readily available. Yep. When we're talking about people at a federational level, the only individuals that the abused person would necessarily have had access to might be the people in that federation themselves. And if it's a federation that doesn't necessarily have a union, because as we were kind of discussing previously, FIFA has got 211 member associations that are signed up to it. 211, right? There are 192 signatories to the United Nations, and we've got 20 odd more at FIFA, so go figure. But with regards to FIFPRO, I think you've got about 67
70,
odd,
yeah.
70. So only 1/3 of the footballing world is covered by FIFPRO. 2/3 are uncovered. So for players in those jurisdictions where they don't even have a union, where are they going to get that information from? So it's fantastic that we now have that possibility.
Yep.
Now it's a case of spreading the gospel, so to speak, and ensuring that everyone has got access to that information.
Yeah.
And that's the next challenge, right?
Just a small thing on that, like it's true, and that is really challenging for us. But that being said, we do represent those players as well. So if they come to us, and we have done it already actually in several cases, I would say that actually most of the cases of abuse are of countries that are outside of FIFPRO, in the sense that there's no player association. And there could actually be a connection on that, right? Because our player unions at national level, they do a lot of work that sometimes help prevent this from happening, although it still happens, of course. But that I wanted to say it because I think it's important that everyone knows, and that, you know, also when you spread the message, if you hear of any situation like this, they can always reach out to FIFPRO, and we will protect them, that we will represent them. So just rest assured about that.
So what I wanted to do next, if I may, which was just to sort of play out how this would actually look. And I say this because we are in a stage, I mean, the stats on the last presentation with Rachel were fantastic. This is the growth trajectory of the sport, especially for women. But what happens when you've got these players coming in and these imbalances of power continue to persist? Most of these people will not have anyone to speak to about this. When they do find someone to speak to about it, as Dev said, it's probably someone within their own organization. And oftentimes, it becomes that person's problem, so there is instantly a conflict. I want to go back to something Katie actually said in the talk yesterday, which was, how many options do girls actually have? Let's step away from UK and its success for a second, but internationally, it's a very small number. The cases that we have worked on, and I don't want to overemphasize this point, but it needs to be said, often the abusers are within the infrastructure themselves. And there's not one, but it tends to be many. And they're also very linked into the government institutions. And often they're not actually backed by local federal laws that protect them. So you're talking about internal systems like FIFA's, you're talking about internal systems within the federations, and you're talking about individuals without much choice in how they can participate in football. With that said, though, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more optimistic, I hope, because we are starting to see the improvement, but it's really important here also to try and set out how we, in this room, through our networks, through our knowledge, can actually drive this forward. This comes back to, we want the players to have the same rights they would always have as humans outside of sport. Sport has, for many decades, made exemptions for itself on the basis of various reasons, but fundamentally, we are now in a world where people are more aware about the need to be socially responsible. We're able to have open discussions about this, no matter which gender you are, no matter where you come from in the world. I think there are some jurisdictions that still argue that certain rights are above other rights, but fundamentally, I think there's an open conversation in corporates, in the institutionals, and in your federation levels as well. Can we talk about some of the improvements that we're starting to see when it comes to women and how rights are being brought up in and across some of these spaces? And I'm going to put the question to you, Alexandra, because I know there's something brewing, and it's something that is very important. We discussed health for a while yesterday. And I'd just like to put the floor back to you now to try and move from where the conversations around abuse have actually led to an opportunity to improve and to take things forward.
Yes, so one of the things that we worked on a lot and that we were able to put it through, although there's, again, a very long way to go, is on the maternity rights for players. So in FIFPRO, we did a report, a research, and then a report in 2017 on the employment conditions of female players. And that report showed that the players were leaving the game, I mean, we saw it, but then we had it in numbers. The players were leaving the game too early, before reaching their peak. And of course, this is not good for the players. And that is our main concern, because we protect the players. But it's also not good for the development of the game, right? Of women's football. And we asked what were the main reasons for these players to leave the game early. And they gave us two reasons. One, very obvious, not enough money. Yeah, we need to live from something. We love football, but you know, there's a moment where we cannot do this double career anymore. Okay, we started working on that, and I'm going to refer to that maybe later. And the other reason, and it was a really high percentage, was that they wanted to start a family. And there was, of course, no protection at all. So we started working on that, and we prepared what was called the FIFPRO parental policy. So it was not only about granting rights to females, that's the first thing that I wanted to clarify, but of course mainly really protecting pregnancy, maternity leave, right to breastfeed, well, all these obvious things that incredibly enough had not been regulated until 2021. So in January 2021, it was when FIFA incorporated these rights into the FIFA RSTP. And that was done because we presented this to FIFA. We said, like, listen, I mean, it is unbelievable that we don't have any protections yet. We did a lot of research to develop this because we wanted to know how it was regulated in other sports. It had not been regulated internationally in any other sports. So that was also very tricky because there were some standards that looked basic and obvious and maybe even like too little what we were proposing according to X country. But for another country, that was a complete revolution, right? So what I feel about these regulations is that they are really amazing because they apply to these 211 members that FIFA has, that Deb was mentioning. And in many of these countries, there is no protection at all for pregnant women on another job, like even outside football. So you are bringing this social change through football that hopefully, this is what I want to think at least, will lead the way, because at national level, probably you will say like, hey, I'm a cleaner, but why do players have a maternity leave and I don't, right? So hopefully this will happen. We are still far away from this because many of the member associations, the federations, have not implemented this, although it is mandatory. It is already mandatory, but they should have put it in their own regulations since the latest July 2021, and most of the countries, and this is the truth, have not done it. But this was 2021. We kept on monitoring and seeing like, okay, what is happening? Now we have a little bit more pregnant players or players that have had kids. So we created a new project that is called the Postpartum Return to Play, with a weird name that probably will change the name because it's not only about postpartum, but also right? To prepare for pregnancy, but anyway. And we created 2 working groups, one with professional football players that have had kids, so they have the experience firsthand and they can tell us like what they needed, what was enough, what was not enough, how their club supported them or not, and what they really missed, even with the new protections of the FIFA RSTP. And then the other the other working group is technical, so it's with doctors, with physiotherapists, etc., that also have experience on this. So what we developed, and it's not launched yet, but you're getting a little bit like the first news. We're going to launch a guidance. Actually, it's 2 guidances. One for players, like, okay, what do I do? I want to become pregnant. How do I plan this? Once I become pregnant, what do I have to do? What are my rights? What are my obligations, etc.? And another one for what we call the players' entourage, and this is clubs, federations, anyone that is around the player to know also what they had to do. Because sometimes it was not about unwillingness, but also about being completely lost. Like the player would come back from her maternity leave, and the physio was a little bit clueless because they did not have specific knowledge on what happens to a pregnant woman that comes back to sport. So they knew how to recover from injuries and this and that, but not from a delivery, right? So yeah, we're really enthusiastic about this project, and part of this project is intended to also include some further obligations within the RSTP. Let's see if we get there. And in the meantime, we also received some new ideas from FIFA on things to incorporate in the FIFA RSTP, including, for example, adoption that had not been included in the beginning. So of course, the players should also have a right to a leave in the case that they adopt, etc. The main problem, and I will stop there because otherwise I just don't shut up. The main problem is that FIFA is addressing it on a gender level. So they are only granting adoption rights to female players. They're only adopting parental rights to female players. And I don't know if they see it, but to me, that discriminates us even more, because we are the ones that have to all the time be in charge, you know, of the kids, on top of the men having the right to be with their children. So it's quite crazy. We will see if we can convince them. But yeah, that's a little bit in a nutshell what we've done with maternity.
Excuse the pun, but what's the due date for this?
Well, this is going to be launched in November, end of November, and with FIFA, that we try to convince them. I hope it's less. Let's do it more like a swift thing. So probably before the end of the year.
Dev, did you want to come in on that? Because otherwise I have another question for you.
Well, just come in slightly on that. Not to quell all the positivity of the wonderful work that FIFPRO has done in bringing this forward. And it's unfortunate that despite the fact this was sought to be implemented worldwide 2 years ago, it's still not completely been rolled out. But it is a huge, huge step. But to answer your question initially with regards to some of the changes that we've seen, going back and just hopefully wrapping up the point on abuse, what we have seen as a let's say a positive byproduct of horrific situations that have taken place in football, and you mentioned with certain federations where it was almost endemic throughout the federation, the abuse that was taking place, a change in the FIFA Code of Ethics that now enables, from a disciplinary perspective, the ability for FIFA, of course there needs to be information that has been received by FIFA, there needs to be a whistleblower, but for FIFA to now go through the investigatory process for any abuse which compromises sexual, mental, or physical integrity. Now, this was something that didn't exist in the FIFA Code of Ethics prior to first knowledge of the first situation that took place 5 years ago. So that was, again, a positive byproduct of a really horrific thing that did happen.
And thank you, because that actually does segue me into the third of the three letters down the side over here. Because we've spent the last day and a half being very inspired, and I think we've talked about a little bit about what empowerment looks like and who's, where these are coming from, what changes we're seeing systemically that can be leveraged by the clubs, by the coaches, by the individuals involved. But it sounds pretty expensive. And I think this goes back to the same point, which is you've got the policies in place. You see the changes, you see the systemic changes. We're hoping new guidance and even mandated guidance comes through that says you are required to do the following things. But I suppose my blunt question is, who's paying? And I say this ironically positively. And maybe I can go first on this, and I'll hand it to you guys in a sec, which is sometimes you need a reason to have money. And I think with examples like the maternity guidance coming out, if you are calling for specialists, for example, who can deal with a post-delivery recovery period, it justifies requesting for additional investment to come into the clubs. Now, I'm not saying you should always have that, we need money, so please give us money, but it starts to drive the conversation more positively as we're not just asking for money for the sake of money, we would actually like money, and here's the reasons why. And I do feel like where conversations go with corporates in particular is that if it's to do with health and safety, for example, you can get a little bit further. And it's about trying to figure out which levers within these opportunities can actually guide the conversations to increasing that investment that we are looking for. And I think it's unanimously been agreed over the last day and a half that money is required. So, putting it back to you guys, and this time I'm going to start with you, Dev. We are talking about significant investment that is required for women's football. Are there opportunities beyond what we've already heard of in the last couple of days? Where do you see it coming from? How do you see it growing? How do you see it being deployed in a way that actually is beneficial to the rights of the players?
Thanks for starting with me. Look, I think we've got to be very mindful because right now we're sitting here on a panel and we're honored to be talking about players' rights and some of the developments within players' rights in the women's game. But, we've discussed this before and you rightly pointed out who's paying for all of this. So it's only one side of the story. If we implement strengthened players' rights, but the clubs and the franchises that are employing or contracting these players don't actually have the means to be able to manage all of this, because ultimately that means we're just going to have a collapse in any case. Yep. Now, when we talk about money and the commercialization of sport, there are many people in this room that work on that side of the sector, and they'll be able to tell you that ultimately you've got to create, and forgive me for using the crass business terminology, but you've got to create a product, and that product has got to have value. Yep. And how do you attribute value? Well, value is based on what someone wants to pay for it. So how many eyeballs are watching this game? How many people are willing to purchase that product or that service? And then ultimately we start trying to put it into numbers. What we have seen, certainly what I've seen in my 9-year exposure to women's football, primarily in the UK, but also in some other jurisdictions, is that over the last, I would say, 2.5 years, there's been a disproportionate increase in interest. Not necessarily from the general public. I mean, that too, but maybe in the circles I've been fraternizing, there's always been interest and focus on it, but all of a sudden we're starting to see the corporates wanting to get involved. Why are the corporates getting involved? Because they can see that there's money in there, right? So as with many of these sporting products, where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from the corporate side. We need it to come from the corporate side. Yep. Yes, we can get grants and funding because of health and safety packages. yes, you know, when someone like Rachel and her team put together a wonderful proposal, you can go over to Sport England, or you can go over to relevant bodies in different jurisdictions where they might exist and get some funding drawn down. But ultimately, who's going to pay for it? The broadcasters and the corporates, the banks, all of the people with big finance. And you need that to start filtering in sooner, because if we start working on implementing heightened players' rights immediately, I'm fearful of the fact that we might put a lot of the clubs in positions that they won't be able to manage. And right at the end of it, that's going to hurt the players in any sense. So going right back to answer your question in short, where's the money coming from? The corporates. And I know there's a few of them in the room right now as well. And you at Clifford Chance have got more access to them than me. So we'll have to turn it back on who you're going to contact.
Look at the time. Oh my gosh. No, look, I agree with everything you said there, Dave, and it is absolutely correct. There is a lot more corporate activity, and it is driven from the value perspective. And I say value loosely there because, so I started my introduction by announcing that I was part of an ESG board at our firm as well. I think that's really something I want to give you guys as some ammunition to use, especially if you're in Europe or working with European corporates, which is the new laws are requiring the proposals right now, but they are requiring all corporates who have a European presence to actually diligence properly and effectively, and there's other terms being bandied around, we don't know what they look like soon, both the social and the environmental impacts of their investments, and what does that actually mean. And as part of that, it's not just limited to Europe. So if they are investing anywhere in the world, in any club, in any aspect of the sport, that can all be brought into this. And it's the same for organizations like Coca-Cola, for example, is headquartered in the US, but actually this would apply directly to them globally because they participate in Europe. And that's the kind of reach that you now have when you start having, what is the value? The value, we've heard earlier, Nike didn't care about how much money was being made for this. They came forward and said, we can see the value in terms of impact. There are many who are setting up funds purely for the value of impact. And there are very many of them who are actually setting up new leagues, new sports, new clubs themselves because they are scared that the existing federations may not be in a position to assure them in the same way that they would like to be assured because these laws are binding on them. So it is a great point to turn it back on because I do think the corporates are ripe for the conversations. And if anything, let's be honest, they can see the growth the same way that we have seen the growth today, right? All the stats that we've seen, huge opportunities, monetary opportunities, of course. If you're selling out stadiums, more viewers than ever before, more broadcast than ever before, it's great. So there is a dual approach to this. And I just think that now, when we look at the rights of the players as part of this, it has to go through the clubs, through those corporates, but actually it also needs to get to the players. And I think there are certain points of this conversation that could benefit a club in its entirety, but not necessarily the players. And I think it's really important to remember who's actually bring the sport together at the end of the day. And this, in personal view on this, and I love yours as well, but you do have some degree of assurances when the clubs are making significant money, so the pro leagues. Come down to grassroots, and how does that look like for those players? And how do they get access to some of these conversations, I think is still a challenge. And to that extent, I mean, again, I turn to FIFPRO, I know you guys have an open door policy in many ways, but it would be great to see and hear from you whether you believe this money is actually going to be able to impact all the way through the life cycle of an athlete.
Yeah, it's a tricky, is it on?
No, they just turned it off because they were like, you've said too many words so far.
Guys?
Here.
Otherwise I shout, I don't care. Oh, you will not shut me up. Well, there are many things I want to say.
Please go ahead.
So one thing is that I think that women's football has already showed its amazing product, and it has already shown that when it's offered, people buy it. But is it offered? Is it shown? And still now, I mean, I was last year in the Copa America, right? Copa America is like the big tournament of South America for women's football, right? In Colombia. I was in two cities, in Cali and Armenia. And I was staying in Armenia first. and I asked the cab driver to get me to the stadium, right? Like Copa America, they were hosts of the Copa America. I was like, yeah, I saw a little bit of movement there. Like, what is happening? The cab driver. I mean, cab drivers always know everything, guys. There was no sign anywhere. There was no advertisement. I didn't see one publicity, one of the Copa America. And we are talking about a very footballistic country. It's Colombia. They breathe football, right? It's South America. In all the continents, they breathe football, right? And no one was even aware that this was happening. So there is a responsibility also from the organizing bodies, like where was CONMEBOL, the confederation at local level, investing their money?
Yeah.
How can it happen that people do not get to know that they are hosting the biggest event for women's football at regional level? How is it possible? And it's the same, like I went to one game of the Euros in England, and I thought, like, oh my God, like this is what has to happen, and that was what doesn't. So there were signs everywhere. There was it was impossible that you wouldn't notice that they were hosting the Euros. It was impossible. I mean, otherwise you had to be blind and deaf and everything because it was all around. But that's the way to do it, right? So it is possible, but sometimes there is not enough intention, and there it's not about funds. Because these organizations, the CONMEBOLs, so confederations, and the FIFAs, they do have the money. And they also have, by statutes, the obligation of non-gender discrimination. And these organizations are non-for-profit. So they are not supposed to put the money aside somewhere for whatever they find nice. They need to distribute it equally for both genders. So to me, like, it really strikes me because they said, and then still the stadiums had really a lot of people, not all the time they were full, but like there was, and I thought, wow, this is really a miracle, How did these people get to know that this was actually happening? Mary Herbst, they were not selling her shirt. Yeah. When they created it, sold out before they announced it. So we are not allowing the opportunity, and this is intrinsic discrimination. Still, 2023, this is discrimination. At FIFA level, we are still having a World Cup where the prize money has 333 freaking million difference. Who can give me one reason to justify this and to not come back to me with how much money the male World Cup makes? Because according to the statutes of FIFA, that is not connected. There is no connection, right? There is no connection between the money produced in the World Cup to the investment that FIFA makes as a non-for-profit organization that has in its statutes that there cannot be any gender discrimination. And please, this is like something I've been thinking about since yesterday. This is a general request to everyone. I almost get a heart attack every time Infantino talks about his daughters and that he will improve women's football because of his daughters. And to all of you guys, I know that here we have amazing men that support it, but don't use that argument. We also have fathers, and we are normal, not because we have fathers, because we treat people equally. So, don't talk about your daughters. Please don't, or your mothers.
That's amazing. So now you know why I was Dave first, and then back to you. But look, I don't actually know how long I've got left because I've turned my back to all the timekeepers. Keep going. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Look, Dave, I do want to come back to you for a second. Again, breathe, recover. It's okay. And if anyone does have an answer to that question, approach with caution, think it through. Alexandra's lovely, don't even worry about it. But if I can go back to what we actually see now in the world, and again, I love the examples, right? I love the examples of there's no visibility. You've got the corporates coming in saying, okay, we want to buy a league, we want to buy a club, we want to invest in the sport, we want to do all of these things. Can you show me the opportunity? There is a gap between we have the players, how do we bring the players in, versus we want to bring money in so you can bring more players in. And how do you select those players? How do you actually ensure those rights? And I want to go back to the examples of Mary used this morning as well, where we are just seeing that sometimes it means firing half a team to bring in a new investor. What's the rights of those players and what happens to them in those situations? Do they just get moved out? Where's the line between investment required and the rights of actually maintaining your, again, I like to say full life cycle because I do think it's pre and post your time with these clubs as well. Open question to you both, but I'd like to start with you if possible, Dave. Oh yeah, does that work again?
Oh, thanks.
No. All right, let's go.
I think if I could just latch on to one thing that Alejandra just said from
Please.
the impassioned speech, which I completely and utterly back you, but one point of clarity, I think many football people in the room would have a heart attack every time President Infantino speaks about anything, let alone just his daughters. But aside from that, with regards to looking at it from a club perspective, it depends on the club strategy. Now, we render services to clubs as well, and we've been exposed to so many different strategies or so many different approaches which don't have a strategy,
Yep.
For right or for wrong. So it really depends on what the sporting director, whether it's an official sporting director, a de facto sporting director, or if it's just the general manager or the CEO or the manager of the team, want to do with the team with regards to player scouting, player selection, whether it's based on attributes, whether it's based on individuals that have already been earmarked and what budget they can attribute to that, right? However, when you said about the example that Mary had given in the morning, which was a wonderful story where, in order to change the setup, the culture, and try and reach the vision that she wanted to reach in a certain period of time, you had to ship out everyone there. Now, from the perspective of these players, if they are professional or even semi-professional, we're going to have contracts in place, right? And the contractual stability would have to remain sanct. Invariably, different jurisdictions, different countries around the world, different federations enable different types of contracts. Now, we were talking with Advocate Betty. I don't know if she's in the room right now, but oh, there you are. You're very, you've done more than most people do, so I'm happy. But we were speaking last night about the differences in contracts, and if you go to the States, you'd have a contract for something that I might look at as something quite simple, and it would be about 50 odd pages with 1 million terms. But you can go over and see contracts in, and I use just for sake of example, not for anything else, but in Bangladesh or in Namibia or in Lesotho, places where we've had the ability to be exposed to work, and you'd have 1 page. You come over to, even here, we're in Central and Eastern Europe, within the Balkan region, some of the contracts that we see at top level for players, males and females, 1 page, 2 pages. Yep. So it's difficult to include all of the terms that we as legal minds might necessarily want to include. However, once you've got that piece of paper there, and you've got some of the fundamental terms there, you have contractual stability straight away, right? In theory, you have contractual stability. Now, if a sporting director wanted to come in and for whatever reason wanted to ship out 10 of these players which have these contracts, then there's a liability there. Now, as to how that liability is going to manifest itself might also differ. And here there's another element of discrimination, right? Because if they are national players and the contracts are going to be terminated by the club, then ultimately the contract is going to be underpinned by national law and is going to be governed at national level within the National Football Association. If there is an international dimension, so let's say, for example, we're in Greece and the player we're referring to, one of the 10 players we're referring to is from England, from the UK. There's an international dimension, and the manifestation of that termination is going to go through FIFA and through the FIFA dispute resolution tribunals. So in that, we've also got this discriminatory practice, but ultimately, it's all going to be underpinned by contractual stability. Now, if we go right down to the grassroots, there'll be situations where there aren't contracts, yep, right? And if we also go to the, let's say, the bridging point between the grassroots and the professional side, where players are going to new countries, they're playing for clubs, they're getting paid, but this is not on paper. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the legality of that or the tax side of that or whatever, but ultimately we have
Find him after the panel. He'll go into it.
But we have situations where players are being paid and it might be cash in hand or it might be done by way of generous expenses or whatever else. Yeah. Here, we don't have anything on paper and there's no stability whatsoever. So if someone wanted to come in and just ship out 10 players, they do it overnight. But it's all based on the strategy. So when we talk about investors and what they're going to look at, they're going to look at what your forecast is, right? Your financial forecast, what your vision is, what sort of impact you want to have over 3, 5, 10 years. That might have a say in terms of how you ship out your players or not. And if it does, in most professional instances, there's going to be a pot of money there that you're going to have to put aside for severance.
Yep. I'm actually going to share one of we've done similar thinking on this, and we've actually mapped out what is the sports ecosystem, we being the Center for Sport and Human Rights. And it's a lovely graphic. I take no credit for any of the graphics, that's for sure. It's got athletes in the middle, it's got the fans around it, and then it's got stadium seats all the way around the center of the stadium. And in each one of those rows is actually a different player in the world of sport with a different interest. And mapping through those contracts, there's about 1,200 contracts in place for a mega sporting event, like a major tournament, a major football tournament. And it's interesting when you said, you've got these terms, you've got the contracts, and who's looking at all of this? And usually your investors will, your insurers definitely will, your bankers will, your financiers, whoever it might be. But actually that's just 4, which means you've got a whole bunch of other people who are also supposed to be looking into the diligence on how the club is managed, run, what the rights of these players are, how they're being protected, if any. And I know Rob was here, I can't see him, somewhere here. But even the insurers are concerned about players' rights not being respected, because there is the FIFA route, yes, but then there's also the human rights element to this, which is actually not because you are a player, but because you are a human, there are fundamental rights that do need to be protected. And often what we are seeing now, especially in the women's sport, women's football, one of them, but women's sport more generally, actually there is those rights themselves, because you suddenly become an athlete, are almost being foregone as a human. And I think it's super important, again, to reconnect those two worlds of sport and the world itself in order to try and revisit exactly where we got to, with why we got to the position with FIFA, and predominantly that's based on history of men's football. But how can we now take all the great work that's being done across all these other organizations and translate that back into improving these systems, but also to ensure that, again, using the great examples from Rachel this morning about what the FA is doing, how you bring the rest of society with you, what's the social impact to this. Reconnecting football back to society, I think, is a very important part of that discussion.
And if I may add, do it in the right way, because sometimes, I think it was said yesterday, women's football is not like the little sister, of men's football, and we don't want to be. I think that is really important. I work in both men and women's football, and because I work in FIFPRO, I probably don't see the nicest face, but oh my God, right? So in men's football, the level of non-payment to football players is crazy. We're talking about almost 50% of players worldwide not getting their payment on the due date, and not that they get paid 5 days later, but we're talking about months, right? Retention of passport, all this type of abuse. So I think it's really important to think about doing it right for women's football, right? Yeah. We don't want to imitate we want to improve what is happening in men's football, but we don't want to imitate their path, because it's not a good result, I'm telling you.
No, and I think thank you, because you've articulated much better than I, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make there, which is that I just think that all the problems we've highlighted so far have been based on what men's football has resulted in. And we just have an opportunity to revisit the drawing board and say, let's do it again. Let's do it better. Let's do it stronger. And like I mentioned earlier, there are now opportunities for us to bring the corporates into this, because it is also their problem. It is everybody who's in that ecosystem's problem. And by the way, the link to that I will send to Marius and Ed, and you guys can receive this via the food chain. But at this point, I am going to pause because I still can't see you.
Can I just make one question?
Sure, I was just turning to questions, so that's perfect.
First of all, I think this topic on players' rights might be probably the most critical piece of what we're talking about today. I think we saw an incredible amount of seats and tickets sold, and I think that's a huge testament to where the women's game is. But sadly, we also see women's teams and women's players threatening to walk out. And it shouldn't come to that. We shouldn't put our players in those positions to have to wear certain armbands, to use the platform of the game. That's when we would be successful. And I would love to ask, you know, this group and others who are advocating for players' rights and team rights, there seems to be so much conflict of interest, and no one's touched on that. Many of you work in the game, and there's a fear of challenging an Infantino or a FIFPRO that is sitting at the table to actually fight for players' rights. And I'm curious, what will it take to overcome those hurdles? Because you alluded to, we all, you know, shun when he speaks, but nothing changes, right? And we know what's right and we know what's wrong. And so we're sitting here and saying very nice things while we're packing stadiums for women's football games, but at the same time, we have Canada and other women's teams threaten to walk out. When are we going to reach that epiphany, and what is it going to take?
Just briefly. No, I think it's a good question, and I like your question because I'd like to think I'm solution-minded like your good self as well. So you've raised an interesting perspective, but at the same time, I think in fairness, it's right to highlight, and I don't just say this because she's sitting next to me and I'm scared of her, but FIFPRO do a lot to challenge FIFA. They do a hell of a lot to challenge FIFA, and if they weren't doing that, we wouldn't have seen the progress that we have seen, particularly with some of the successes you've mentioned with regards to maternity rights and all the things that are coming through. So that challenge is constantly there. Often in politics, in football or otherwise, we don't really see that. However, what I can testament to, without Alexandra saying it herself, is that FIFPRO and other bodies are challenging. They are challenging strongly, and I think it would be great for that information to be spread out in a more probative way, and for everyone in this room to be able to latch onto those movements and to support those movements even better, because from that, everyone will be able to understand that those challenges are taking place and things are progressing, rather than having a feeling that no one is willing or brave enough to challenge the status quo. No, it's happening. It's happening. If it wasn't happening, then we wouldn't see these elements of progress. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. If I like maybe to add like an example, like before the World Cup, FIFPRO organized the players, and we got 150 players that were playing actually in the World Cup to send a letter to FIFA saying like, what's going on? You know, where are our equal conditions? What is happening? And it was after that letter was sent with all the top players from the best countries going to the World Cup, and many things were changed, right? I mean, the conditions in which the players are now going to the World Cup are almost equal to the men. Now, the conditions, I mean, traveling, hotel, amount of people that travel with the players, etc. So I think that this kind of movement really shake the system and they help. That being said, I find it really unfair that we put it on the players, that they have to do this, you know? Like, it's not fair. They have to be able to focus on their game, and some of them do it like really from the heart and they want to and go ahead. But sometimes I feel that also we, in general, you know, as society, we put pressure and we're like, why are you not doing this? Like, where is Messi? What is he saying? Yeah, okay, we can agree or not if he speaks or not, but is it his duty? He's a football player. He plays football and he does it marvelously. So, like, why is it him that has to speak up? And the other thing I wanted to say is that I work a lot with FIFA, you know, like we need to have this interaction. And I said it before, I think there are lots of people within FIFA that are marvelous and they want to push changes and they want to, you know, they have the right mentality. But FIFA is a very political organization. And so I really think that, and this is me, because I don't know if FIFPRO would agree, but I really think that we need a very deep transformation of the whole system, as long as it is political, and as long as each one of the 211 members has a vote. You don't want to sanction any member. You don't want to tell a member, hey, what are you doing? Because next time they will not vote for you. Yeah. And it's sad, but it's true. So the whole system probably needs like a deep revision.
Yeah. If I may add to that, and I agree fully with why is it that we're asking the players to play football, but also to fix the whole system and be administrators and all the rest of it. I mean, I would have a very busy day if that was my role. But I did want to touch on one thing, because I do advise a number of international federations, and the conflicts point comes up very regularly, especially in terms of who's voting for me, who's funding me, where's the next bid going. It's pretty much the same crowd, just sort of playing past the parcel, right? Like it's, if you get a human rights claim, don't worry, I'll contribute another $1 billion and that'll pay for all the damage that happened, but don't tell me to fix my systems, right? Like that's a conversation that you can imagine happening, I'm not saying football, I'm not saying women's football, I'm saying any sport. And what you're trying to see, what you're starting to see now is that actually the levers in the past, and when I remember there was an inquiry in the US, a bipartisan panel that was pulling 5 of the top sponsors to the IOC's Winter Olympics in Beijing. And all of the heads of sustainability were pulled up on public television, fully streamed, on why are you participating in this sport, in this event. The predominance of the response was because the US hasn't sanctioned it. So why should we as US companies be forced to sanction it? The next question that all of them obviously had prepared statements, but actually what they were trying to get at is, you know all the problems that are going on. And one of them actually put their hand up and said, what do you think we pay for? And they went, you pay because you're supporting the games. They're like, no, we're renting space. We're marketing. That's all it is. We don't get a say in what that contract actually says. And we haven't had a say because it's always been, if Coke falls out, Pepsi comes in. Right? It's not Visa, it's MasterCard. Right? And those are sort of the biggest sponsors of these events. And the federations in the past have been able to hold that ground and say, you need us. And I think what you're starting to see is it's not so much a you need us anymore. And this is, I will also attribute this to the esport world, because there's no more that there's one big event. You have other events being streamed. There's much more competition in the market. And when we were working with the Super League and on conversations on Super League, you actually saw this come up when UEFA and FIFA got up and said, we are the custodians of the sport. We stand for respect and culture and all the rest of the things that were announced. You'd never hear them say that before. But that's actually forcing some very challenging conversations about who am I voting for and why. And I say this almost optimistically as if we're moving in the right direction, but sometimes I look at politics and I worry. I'm currently based in the UK, and I've seen what they've done on environment recently. It's full U-turn. Goodbye, we're done here. And so it goes back to Dev's point, which is you can vote in the best human being on earth, and you can have the best team around them, but somewhere along the line, you might find yourself in a position where you're having to choose one or the other, and it's the leadership in that space is really missing right now. And that's really why I also go back to have the policy, implement the policy, put it on writing, put it there somewhere so you have something to hang your hat on, and then once you've got something to hang your hat on, find enough people to help you keep that hat pegged onto the wall, right? And that's really, it's really tough. It's really tough, it's really expensive, it's really exhausting. It's often goes to the point of who's supposed to do it. And, you know, speaking openly and personal opinion on this, which is governance challenges are going to get much worse as we start going to multi-continent, multi-country events. And it's going to come down to this entire room and many others who are not in this room to actually step up and say, why do you have 14 different legal jurisdictions for one World Cup? I mean, I don't get it. I'm a lawyer. I practice at the level where that would be a firm fit for purpose. It still doesn't always make sense. And so those are the sort of the challenges. And now when we start to look at the jurisdictions coming through, you start to see the cracks in the governance structures. And that's where you have an opportunity to step in and say, why is this happening? And I agree with you. We need to say that. And we don't need to make that the problem of the players, because it's tough and it's complicated and it's often scary because it might be them on the line. Sorry, I had my moment of rant now. We
We've got time for 2 questions. There has to be the question. Was it Sophie? Okay, we'll do Betty and Monique, but it has to be the question.
I'm very curious about how Title VII, that prevents sexual harassment in the United States and has all these internal rules and regulations that have to be met. If a sexual harassment case or a player from the United States has asked FIFPRO to represent them in a proceeding for sexual harassment in Europe, I'm really curious what the interplay is between U.S. law preventing sexual harassment and the administrative proceeding in FIFA.
So actually, let's see. So normally, although we have done it in other occasions, I'm now thinking, but normally we will represent, because we always try to protect players, it doesn't matter, but like normally we will represent players when they would be able to go to the FIFA bodies, right? But not everyone is under the umbrella, let's say, of FIFA, right? So you need to be a FIFA official, like the accused needs to be a FIFA official. So that is the scenario in which we would be able to go to FIFA and that they would investigate, et cetera, in principle, right? The other situation can be that there is something going on at national level and this is reported to whatever body it should be reported to, and nothing happens for more than 3 months, and then FIFA can also, take over, which they will do if we push, otherwise not. So it really varies a lot. What we did, and we have already had the experience in one case. I'm thinking whether to say no. Let's not mention the country. So in one country there was an abusive coach abusing the players, all national, like from the same nationality, and they reached out to us, and because it was not possible to help through a union, we actually represent them in the FA bodies at national level, which was really challenging because it was like, okay, we're like in the Netherlands. And so it is sometimes possible, but that's a little bit how it plays. So normally, like with this kind of international dimension or FIFA official cases, let's say, it's when we're going to be in a better position to protect them. But as well, but again, like in any case where a player is going through any type of abuse, they can always reach out and we can see what is the best possible way. It might be that the best thing to do is to contact a lawyer at national level and we can work together, exactly. And it will depend as well what the player wants to do. Like, does the player want to go to criminal courts or does the player want to do like an administrative, right? And this is also really, really important. What can be done through FIFA in the worst or best, depending on how you see it, case scenario, is to ban this person for life on top of fines, whatever. But like, of course, this person is still going to be free in society, right? So depending on what the player wants to do or feels that he or she can do, they will decide or not, and we cannot absolutely judge on that. This is something I also wanted to say, because there's a lot of like, oh, why didn't the player go to, the criminal courts? Well, is that a question, or is the question like, why was she or he abused? Are you kidding me? Yeah. It's not so easy to go through the proceedings.
The question a little simpler. Have you actually represented Americans in proceedings?
No.
Okay. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, Betty, on that one, there have been proceedings that have had U.S. nexus, and it has been a question of which jurisdiction would you like to go for, how would you like to proceed. For some of them, the question is also who is the person, and that's a really challenging one to answer, because sometimes there is a risk of life. Getting this wrong could detriment witnesses, it could detriment a lot of other people. So it sometimes does come down to things, and I hate to say this, but it does come down to things like race, social background, what level of seniority you are within the ranks, how much money or support you have from your fans, etc. So those are all part of the same discussion. but it's really optional. FIFA's route tends to not have any criminality attached to it, so it's an internal process at the end of the day, versus a criminal proceeding which could have repercussions if the person gets put into prison, but also FIFA doesn't get involved necessarily in that unless it's sort of access to information, disclosure requirements, and so forth.
Title VII case would be a civil proceeding,
Yeah.
not necessarily a criminal proceeding. So I'm really curious what the interplay would be and how, what strategy would be implemented.
Thank you.
One more. Sorry. Do you want to say a reply there? Shortly.
Just literally one sentence with regards to interplay. So we were instructed in a matter several years ago. We can go into detail later on. I won't bore everyone now, but parallel proceedings can take place in this kind of instance because ultimately at FIFA, as was rightly mentioned by both David and Alexandra, it's a private law mechanism which just works on internal governance procedures and what they will do to that official who is within the framework. So there's no reason why a parallel proceeding can't take place, whether it's civil or criminal, within the state law. And how that interplay would take place is, as David mentioned, there might be disclosure of information, there might be a little bit of communication, but again, that communication is only going to be maximized or availed at the discretion of the individuals concerned, whether the state court parties want to speak to FIFA about it, and vice versa, or not. That's really it. In our situation, we had some limited interplay. The state courts actually wanted to engage with FIFA. FIFA was unfortunately quite reluctant to do so. However, it's certainly possible to have an interplay, and it's certainly possible to have parallel proceedings.
I'm going to be as brief as possible, but it is an answer I want. So as a self-confessed and very proud challenger of the status quo, particularly at board level, I want to ask, what would be the use of having a belt and braces reform of the governance at the top? There isn't enough non-executive director representation at the top in these organisations at FIFA and FIFPRO, but FIFA most certainly, there isn't enough non-exec, and it doesn't have to be vote, because if it's vote, it's one or the other, and therefore there's bias. But if it's non-exec, what you're really dealing with is three things, which is hindsight, insight, and foresight. And is there enough hindsight, what we've done wrong, how could we do it differently? Is there enough insight, what happens outside of our organisation, so we're not a closed shop? Do we have enough foresight, and are we brave enough to change the way we do reform so that we can actually make this better for all people? Very much so for players, because for me, it's the players that suffer each and every time if we don't get the governance right at the top. So I'm asking Dave, because I know you'll be honest about this, but I could ask this to everybody. Is there a case here now for once and for all belt and braces reform so that we have much more non-exec director interplay and representation at this organisation?
Theoretically, yes.
But
And that's, I think the but, to be fair, and this is not to cop out, but I'm happy to discuss this from my perspective in more detail, because I can see Ed, he's just peering over me.
No, this is important. Okay, like,
Yeah, all right.
It's a shorter lunch, everybody. I'm just saying to you. I think this is important.
And that shorter lunch is going to be blamed on my waffling. So no, I think there definitely is a theoretical angle to do that. And Alexandra mentioned that this is something that would potentially benefit the entire ecosystem. I don't disagree with that at all. But I'm looking at it from a practical perspective. The gentleman had a very solution-based question earlier, and I'm thinking about it from that view. How are we going to achieve this? What are we going to do to achieve this? We'd have to be in a position, or everyone involved would have to be in a position where you can persuade the relevant governing body to adopt that kind of change to their governance model. Now, that in itself is going to be a significant challenge, and a challenge that might not be surmounted, particularly within this current regime and possibly within the next regime, because of the inherent nature of how it works. So I think theoretically, yes, I agree with you. I sit as a NED on several federation bodies myself, so I can see the value. Well, I hope that there's value that I give to these bodies, but I can see the theory behind it. As to whether it's something that we can realistically and practically achieve is a different story, to be honest.
Just one.
No, go.
No, just one thing, like, because I don't know exactly like how what you meant with the question, but like if I think of FIFPRO, for example, we have had a huge like reform, statutory and everything, where we implemented an 1/3 gender diversity. So it doesn't need to be like that the 1/3 is female. It can also be the 1/3 is male. We're not there yet. But I get you, and I fully agree. And I think that as FIFPRO, and I honestly believe we're leading in this sense, but we are not there. We're not there. Definitely, we're not there. And I remember all the discussions like to make this happen, to make the gender diversity like quota happen, and oh my God. And we are talking about people that are normally quite, progressive and, wanting change and wanting, so yeah, I can imagine in the other organizations, but I fully agree with you, and I think that all of us, we all have to look at our own organizations as well, right? It's not enough to say like, oh, look at FIFA, oh, what are they doing? Like each one of us can be better, definitely, like each one of us.
And I just wanted to add, actually, it is possible to do a full belts and braces if everyone else is amenable to it. And I think that's the problem. So for 2 federations now, I've worked in the background. And actually, they were like, yeah, we need to do this, so let's get on with it. And the policies came in, they're already in place, nobody knows about them, and they didn't make a hue and cry about it, but they were just like, we just need to crack on with it. And they realized if they had made a hue and cry about it, that's a completely different story. And the only other point I wanted to add, because I'm sitting between you and lots of hungry people, but there was, your comment about there's not enough expertise. I wanted to challenge that a bit, because I do think non-sporting expertise being brought into sport is actually really helpful to sport. And I think if that pool were expanded, you'd actually find a lot more competence out there, and especially if you're looking at certain topics with specific focus. And I mean something like human rights or biodiversity. You can just find the experts for it, bring them in for that purpose, but then execute on the purpose within the strategy, be done with it, and move on. And that is exactly how to do it, because they will come in with scientific knowledge, with background, with all the expertise, and be able to tell the rest of the board, you're all getting this wrong, and here's why, and here's how we're going to fix it. And that's all I want to say. But I would like to thank my panel, if I may, and also invite everyone to go to lunch, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.